Good day, everyone. Today, we are going to discuss about the Japanese occupation in the Philippines.
When did the Japanese occupation start? It all started on December 8, 1941, right after or 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 8, 1941, Japan invaded the Philippines. A mix of local and American forces, most without combat experience, rushed to hold off the professional veterans of Imperial Japan.
Now, let's talk on the main reason why Japan invaded or occupied the Philippines. The main reason is that they wanted to gain power over their neighbors and also to oust American and European influences from the region. So during 1930s, Japan began a campaign of imperial expansion in the Western Pacific. Early in 1941, the Western powers were beginning to pay attention to the situation. America sent troops to the Philippines. Although they were trying to move toward Philippine independence, the Japanese threat was too great to ignore. For the Japanese, the Philippines were strategically important for several reasons. Taking them would deprive the U.S. of an advanced base in the region. It would also provide a Japanese base for attacks on the Dutch East Indies, and it would secure lines of supply and communication between the Japanese home islands and their conquered territories. In this slide, we can see the map of Luzon Island showing Japanese landings and advances from December 8, 1941 to January 8, 1942. On December 8, 1941, the Japanese landed in the Philippines. On December 20, 1941, they landed in the south of Luzon, and it is the island holding most of the U.S. troops. And on December 22, 1941, the main attack began. On December 8, 1941, around 3 a.m. local time, the news reached U.S. forces in the Philippines that Pearl Harbor was under attack. The long-awaited war with Japan had finally come. Confusion followed about what to do with American planes on the ground in the Philippines. No decision to prepare for a defense or to attack Japanese positions led to unreadiness. Instead, many American planes were caught on the ground and destroyed in Japanese air attacks. The same day, Japanese forces landed on the small island of Bataan, and on the 12th day, they landed in the south of Luzon, the island holding most of the troops. Meanwhile, following the airstrikes, U.S. naval forces withdrew. On the morning of December 22, where the main attack began, Japanese troops invaded at 3 points of northern Luzon. The American 26th Cavalry put up a fight at Rosario but were pushed back. The next day, more Japanese troops landed further south, quickly overcoming the scattered U.S. forces they encountered. Led by General MacArthur, the Americans began following their contingency plan to withdraw into the Bataan Peninsula. Confusingly, it is not on Bataan Island, but a defensible part of Luzon. Supplies were hastily pulled back into the peninsula, and troops rushed to join up with their comrades there. Meanwhile, American forces carried out delaying actions at 5 agreed positions, holding up the Japanese while the rest of the troops regrouped. Despite again receiving confusing and uncertain orders, American and Filipino forces held open the routes of retreat. Forces leapfrogged each other back toward the peninsula, one group holding the line while another retreated and set up the next defensive position. Bridges were protected until everyone was through and then blown to prevent the Japanese following. On December 30, 1941, the Japanese realized what was happening. The pressure mounted as they tried to cut off the Americans before they could complete their retreat. The U.S. 194th Tank Battalion suffered 50% losses holding them up. Next, on January 6, the Japanese captured the crucial Layak Junction at the neck of the peninsula. However, it was too late. The Americans had completed their withdrawal. Now, let's tackle about the Battle of Bataan. 3 months of fighting followed as the Japanese tried to defeat the American Peninsula stronghold. Early on, overconfidence and poor planning led to mistakes on the Japanese part. The experienced troops who had brought them success were replaced by inexperienced ones. It was done to free the veterans to fight elsewhere. With the work of taking the Philippines incomplete, it proved to be a mistake. While the Americans held the neck of the peninsula in the north, a Japanese amphibious landing arrived in the south. It was disrupted, leaving the troops who had landed caught in a small and shrinking pocket of territory. The pocket was finally overwhelmed after 3 weeks of fighting. Meanwhile, there was fighting at the neck of the peninsula, in which the Americans had some victories against the Japanese. However, the Americans were trapped. Illness, lack of food, and constant fighting wore them down. MacArthur was ordered to leave by President Roosevelt. The general gave a speech promising he would return. In early April, the Japanese made major breakthroughs. The Americans and Filipinos were overwhelmed. Most were captured, and only 300 American soldiers made it to the island of Corregidor. After the Battle of Bataan, the Battle of Corregidor followed. Corregidor was a coastal artillery position at the mouth of Manila Bay. It was equipped with mines, anti-aircraft guns, and shore batteries. At the start of May 1942, 11,000 troops were there. The Japanese bombardment Corregidor in preparation for an attack. Their bombers destroyed most of the shore batteries, taking heavy casualties from the AA guns or the anti-aircraft guns in the process. On May 1, a heavy bombardment was launched, a prelude to the main assault on the island. On the night of the 5th of May, 2 battalions of Japanese infantry landed on the island. They successfully formed a beachhead into which reinforcements of artillery and tanks poured. They pushed the defenders back into a stronghold at Malinta Hill. The Americans had nowhere left to go. Late on the 6th day of May 1942, the American General Wainwright asked for terms of surrender. The Battle of the Philippines was one of America's greatest military defeats. It was also one of the most successful acts of resistance to Japanese expansion in the early war. It held up Japanese forces while the Americans regrouped from the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and while MacArthur prepared a new base of operations in Australia. For the survivors of the American force taken captive by the Japanese, years of misery followed. Thousands died in terrible conditions on board prison ships or in forced labor camps. America had lost its first grand action of the war. However, it would soon be ready to fight back.
The Japanese occupation in the Philippines. The first topic will be all about the Japanese martial law. By early 1942, the Philippines was under by the Japanese rule. On January 3, 1942, a day after Manila became an occupied city, General Masaharu Homa. General Masaharu Homa is the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Imperial Forces, issued a proclamation announcing the end of the American occupation and the imposition of the martial law in the country. One of his first orders was surrender of firearms. Those who were still caught with weapons were detained at the dungeons of Fort Santiago and in other detention posts. 3 weeks later, on January 23, 1942, Vargas received an order from General Homa to assume the position of the Executive Commissioner of the Central Administrative Organization of Occupied Philippines. Movement was registered with the imposition of curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. and finally from midnight to 6 a.m. from May 18 onwards. Total blackout was lifted on May 4, 1942. What happened after the fall of Corregidor? After the fall of Corregidor, no one could travel without a pass from its army. This prohibition in travel was lifted a month. In Manila, the streetcar were still operational. Many people rode bicycles and docars, wartime carriages pulled by horses. The casco, a large banca pulled by motorboats, transported goods and foodstuffs from Manila to Guagua, Pampanga. Freedom of religion. On January 14, 1942, issued a declaration to Christians in the Philippines in which he expressed the view of the Japanese army to assure freedom of religion. By 1943, Paris priests were being required to use their pulpits to convince the people that it was useless to resist Japanese rule. The second topic will be all about the life during the wartime. Neighborhood and District Associations. On August 8, 1942, Vargas issued the Neighborhood and District Association must be organized for the purpose of providing means for protection under jointly responsibility. They were supposed to cooperate with the Japanese army to keep the residents within the area of jurisdiction from anti-Japanese activities. Consequences by the Japanese. Violation of Japanese orders and laws was considered a hostile act, which meant death penalty. Also punishable with death was the injuring of a Japanese soldier. If the assailant could not be seen, some Filipinos were held hostage by the Japanese military. Food crisis, which led to hunger. The worsening food crisis reached a point where the populace started eating plain or lugaw, or rice porridge. At time, they subsisted on binatog or boiled grains of dried corn with grated coconut and pinches of salt. In spite of the government's ardent call for the national food production, the people suffered from deprivation and starvation. Several well-to-do families had to dig up the canned goods they had placed under the ground at the start of the war. The Japanese confiscated palay stocks stored in the kitimalig or warehouse of the farmers. They ransacked private backyard, loading their trucks with chicken and hogs. The frequent food forays virtually stopped land production, causing imminent food scarcity and escalating prices of prime commodities. Diseases leads to death. Due to scarcity of food, medicine and basic services, thousands died of malaria, malnutrition, tuberculosis, and other diseases. Many died on sidewalks such as desolation condition brought about by the increase of crime rate, which included burglary and hold-up. Others even tried to kill in order to survive in a highly competitive, hostile environment. The third topic will be the reforming of the Philippine government. On December 2, 1942, the Japanese military administration announced that political parties had been dissolved of their own free will. The Kapisanan sa Paglilingkod sa Bagong Pilipinas o Kalibapi, a non-political organization, was established. Kalibapi's aim was to bring about the rapid reconstruction of the Philippines and the rehabilitation of the Filipino people. This organization was designed to coordinate all activities and services of associations and individuals concerned with the promotion of the total well-being of every person and to foster a stable foundation for the new Philippines by inculcating the Asian virtues of hard work, faith, self-reliance, loyalty, bravery, discipline, and self-sacrifice. Jose Vargas became the ex officio president of the Kalibapi. Benigno Aquino was appointed Director General of the said organization. June 18, 1943, convention in Manila, the Kalibapi members appointed a committee to nominate the members of the Preparatory Commission for Philippine Independence or PCPI. 4 months after the establishment of the PCPI, the first draft of the new Philippine Constitution was completed. Written in Tagalog and in English, the Constitution had a preamble and 12 articles. This body of laws was not submitted to the Filipino for ratification. The Second Republic of the Philippines. On October 14, 1943, Manila was in a holiday mood despite the traces of war. 500 to 800,000 people gathered in front of the legislative building that morning to witness the proclamation of Philippine independence and the inauguration of the Republic of the Philippines. In the afternoon, a pact of alliance between the Philippines and Japan was signed by the Philippine Minister of Foreign Affairs, Claro M. Recto, and the Japanese ambassador Shuzo Murata. Then on October 18, Laurel announced the appointment of his cabinet. Claro M. Recto, Minister of Foreign Affairs; Antonio de las Alas, Minister of Finance; Teofilo Sison, Minister of Justice; Quintin Paredes, Minister of Agriculture and Commerce; Jose Yolo, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court; and Jose Villa, Acting Executive Secretary. The President of the Republic, elected by the majority of all members of the National Assembly, was given the highest executive power by the Constitution. He was to serve a single term for 6 years, being the Commander-in-Chief of all armed forces of the country. National Education Board. President Laurel created the National Education Board to study curriculum changes and to develop a more suitable educational program for the country. The board advocated enhancement of the Filipino identity by giving emphasis to the study of the national language and history. It also recommended the teaching of Haitian history and culture. The board also adopted the semestral system with a vacation long enough for students to rest and in time for the rainy season to lessen disruption of classes. Pensionados. The government also sent selecting young men to Japan as pensionados to study at Japanese schools. Members of the Japanese constabulary taught them Japanese methods of discipline. These pensionados had to be cleansed of anything anti-Japanese to operate in the new environment. Use of media. The media was used to spread more Filipino propaganda line. Posters and leaflets called for the support of the Republic. A monthly magazine were also not treated in Manila but also in the provinces. News stamps were also printed for the Republic, showing the government nationalist orientation. In publications, the flag was highlighted, the Philippine national anthem was translated into Tagalog. It replaced the Japanese national anthem and awit sa paglikha ng bagong Pilipinas. Religious activity closely supervised. The Japanese military administration did closely supervise the affairs of the church. The Bureau of Religious Affairs was created, an agency under the Executive Commission to control the activities of the religious order, like the issuance of permits for special collections, meetings, and religious parades. The church was ordered to report the amount of money it had received as donations. Its financial status was obliged to disclose. All priests, ministers, and other religious officials had to secure permit from the government in solemnizing marriages. Despite Laurel's attempts to make independence real, many elements of the Japanese policy were still there. Censorship of the media continued as before. Nippongo classes were still mandatory. Listening to foreign shortwave stations. Everywhere in the land, people live in fear. Men did fear the spies like the Ganaps and Makapilis, as well as the dreaded Kempetay, and their zona system whereby the local males were herded in one place, usually a public. Resistance and restoration. The surrender of Bataan and Corregidor and the immediate retreat of General MacArthur to Australia marked the end of American assistance to the country. These events were only perceived as temporary, moved by their sense of nationalism. Others felt that it was glorious to fight for the country's freedom. They had realized it was their duty to their Filipinos to defend the country from foreign aggression. After the surrender of Bataan, the group moved to Antipolo. During the later stages of the war, The hunters ROTC guerrillas cut Japanese communication lines, blew up roads and bridges, and destroyed their territory. Their newspaper, Thunderclap, which came out in 1943, oftentimes changed its place of publication to confuse the enemy forces. To restoration. The Gumps were the former pro-Japanese Sakdalistas who served as spies for the Japanese military authorities, while the Polahanes from Samar, which means Pola, acted as guides for the Japanese in their effort to arrest people who supported the guerrilla cause. The most dreadful one, the Makapili, Makabayan Katipunan ng mga Pilipino, was headed by General Artemio Ricarte, Benigno Ramos, and Pio Duran. This group was organized after the American Liberation Forces had already entered in the Philippines territory. Makapili was formally launched in Manila on December 8, 1944, amidst a gala ceremony attended by General Yamashita. On September 21, 1944, President Laurel proclaimed martial law in the country by virtue of Proclamation Number 29. The election on April 23, 1946 resulted in the victory of the Liberal Party, with Rojas and Quirino as the elected president and vice president respectively. Their party won 9 out of 16 contested senatorial seats. On May 6, 1946, Rojas was inaugurated as the last president of the Philippine Commonwealth.